Hi, my name is Jeremy Thompson, and I'd like to welcome you to part one of a one-part series called Drawing is Incredibly Difficult. Today I'm going to be drawing a fantasy painting of an ice dragon bursting through the frozen ground while a couple of Norse sort of warriors attempt to take down the beast. Or maybe steal its treasure, or maybe they're just in a terrible place at the wrong time. I'm not really sure, but that's one of the fun things about drawing these sort of still images. You can interpret them however you want because there really isn't any context. I usually start by painting a drawing with thumbnails, and I tend to make two kinds. There's the one kind that is client-facing, where the thumbnail, needs to communicate the information clearly without any assistance, and they kind of live on their own. And the other one is for me, where the images are pretty vague and a little bit of a hot mess, and today we're doing the hot mess one. So these little scratchy blobs that you're looking at, these are the versions that I can rattle them off pretty quickly and explore ideas. So the one that I decided to develop is this little guy right here. Throughout the time lapse, I'll show the entire process from start to finish, including a couple of major design mistakes that I made along the way. I've deliberately left those in because I think it's an honest representation of what the drawing process is actually like. Every illustration has its moments where it feels like it's falling apart, and then, this drawing was very kind to provide several moments of that. For the painting, I'm using Rebelle 8, which has by far become my favorite program of pretty much all time for painting and drawing. One of the things I love about Rebelle so much is that it was designed not to be a clinical computer program. It feels human, it feels made, and I love that when you make them kind of mix different media together, oils, watercolor, pencils, ink, all of it works together in this really convincing way, and it's very squishy and squashy, and I love it. Even when I make a major mistake, which happens a lot more than I'd like to admit, Rebelle is just super easy to work with instead of sort of fighting against it, and quite often these mistakes actually end up in the painting, and it makes the painting a little bit better in my opinion. A real pleasure to work in. So at this stage, this is where I start building the image out with a black line and shape. Like a lot of painters, this is essentially the underdrawing of the shapes that will be eventually filled in. But for right now, they're going to be doing all the heavy lifting. This stage is incredibly important because it communicates all the information, especially to myself, both now and several hours from now when the thought process tends to get a little bit murky. It's really the roadmap that's going to determine whether this becomes a successful painting or not. I also need to make sure that the overall design is working and it's going to translate well and work on every stage of the process. This is where I try to solve as many of the major design problems as best I can before I start rendering. I don't go into great detail here. Instead, I keep this image zoomed out because, it kind of has to work as a tiny little square just as well as a large print. I'll also flip the canvas back and forth to make sure that the major forms are reading properly and that the composition has a really good sense of flow. For this design, I've chosen a dragon's head to be the main focal point. My intention is to increase the contrast around the head later on, and I've built the composition around a strong diagonal line that leads your eye up towards the warriors on the top right, down at the bottom left. The other idea I wanted to explore was making the dragon feel a little more different, more worm or snake-like with bat-like wings attached to a little bit closer up to its neck. One of the difficult things about working with line rather than immediately blocking everything is in a silhouette is that you're constantly making assumptions that you're assuming the design's going to work, that the forms will read in 3 dimensions, and that future me is competent enough to paint in the things that you've just promised yourself is possible. One of the great things I love about Rebelle is the wet medium, the way it handles it. I'm using a watercolor here and just mixing in dark blue and some white on top, and it feels so good, and it just mixes so well, and especially blocking in tones, it works perfectly. And I love the fact that after you draw, you can dry it and then you can reactivate it, and that you can also mix things that just have no earthly reason being together, like oils and impasto, graphite and ink and all that stuff. They all just sort of mix together really well, and it makes the drawing process a lot of fun. Just a quick note I wanted to mention was that you'll probably see these notes popping up every once in a while through this time lapse. These are just notes for me for the end of the drawing session so that I can use these as a reminder for the next time I load up the program. I can give myself a quick refresher, see what I need to be doing. Little areas, little reminders, that sort of thing, and it really helps me just keep the flow going and making sure that I'm staying the course from start to finish. As we get further into the painting, I'm really starting to define the major shapes and build stronger sense of depth. At this point, I'm trying to preserve the dynamic feeling of the original sketch while gradually replacing it with something that's a little more solid and believable. I'm also pushing color into it, specifically that big, thick, icy blue, and I define more of that sort of three-dimensionality by adding contrast as well as dropping it in certain areas, giving it a bit of a hazy look. I'm also adding color into the wings. I'm slowly pushing in a bit more of a pinky magenta tone because I want to give the idea that the ice crystals around, the light is hitting it and bouncing off and keeping that really higher frequency color, as well as mixing a bit of that lower red color in there too. I wanted to give it a bit of a outer worldly kind of feel and have it so it's not entirely sure if we're on this version of planet Earth or a version of planet Earth or some other place completely different. This is one of the differences between illustration and concept art. A concept artist, their job is primarily communication, specifically of the design. They need to be clear with the design information because someone else may have to rebuild it later in production. But an illustration like this is trying to communicate more of mood, drama, and storytelling rather than the structure and form. So it's much closer to something you'd see on the cover of a fantasy novel like a D&D source book or some sort of fantasy art rather than a production design sheet. This is also where that design flaw I was talking about earlier finally catches up to me. The time lapse doesn't really show it, but there were several points where I just had to completely stop and stare at the image for several minutes. And I was kind of asking myself, like, what was wrong with this painting? Eventually, the cold truth presented itself, and I'd made a mistake with the dragon's wings. I'd attached them too up high on the neck, and because of that, the foreshortening wasn't really reading properly. So the entire anatomy just kind of felt awkward, and I couldn't entirely and immediately explain why. I had to sit there and stare at it and flip it back and forth. And once I'd figured it out, there really wasn't really a shortcut to sort of fix it or Band-Aid solution. So I had to pull the wings off and move them further back and redesign the muscle structure and all that sort of stuff so that it felt like it belonged a little bit together. One thing I really appreciate about working in Rebelle during moments like this is just how forgiving the canvas system is. It's like when you've got major structure problems, you're just not moving lines around, you're moving everything around. So you can repair and like blend bits back together because the system's canvas based and works on top of the canvas. Everything just blends really well. Light, oily, less oily. The textures, it blends back very easily and makes everything so much easier, which is a really important part considering this is such a laborious process. So it's something I really, really appreciate. One of the challenges, I didn't really know what a dragon looked like. I don't spend a lot of time looking at dragons. So I looked at a bunch of different artists, sort of what their approach was and see what they had and to see if there's some sort of consensus as if there was a consistent anatomy. And it turns out there really isn't. Some dragons are kind of very human-like and some are kind of like very creature-like. So I decided I'm just going to go for snake and worm-like and see what I could do with that. So going back to the painting, once the wings had been moved, I decided to repaint all of the body that had been previously hidden underneath them. And during that process, I also realized that the hands weren't working. That sort of human versus animal creature. I thought that area down there, they had to go. I'd originally want them to have sort of this sort of slight, delicate, almost sort of mincing quality, but they just weren't really contributing much to the design. They were pulling attention away from the head. So I just, like I said, I simplified it and just removed them completely. Being able to step back, look at your work critically, and admit that something isn't working is a skill that's just as important as the drawing itself. Finally reached the stage where I feel comfortable and am committing to the final detailing pass. I've been refining the areas through the painting, but this is the point where I no longer think I'm going to tear into the image or redesign it in any sort of major way. So that means I can finally focus on the finishing rather than fixing. This is also the most dangerous stage of any painting. You're approaching that 90% mark, and that's usually when the doubt really starts creeping in. You begin asking yourself, is this actually working? Have all this time that I've spent on this thing, is it actually going to become a thing? Is it going to look good? Am I going to be happy with it? Do I have any business owning even any art materials? Should I just become that tax lawyer that my parents wanted me to be? Well, it's a surprisingly common feeling, and I think being aware of it is super important of any sort of creative piece, regardless if you're, where you are at your career. There's a quote often, but I think it's falsely attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, and it's always stuck with me, and it's always in the back of my head, especially at this time. And that is, art is never finished, it's just abandoned. And I have always held that statement as a truth. I could happily keep rendering this painting for months on end, but eventually, you reach a point of diminishing returns where every extra hour adds a little bit less and less to the final image. So my goal is simply to get it as close as I can to what I kind of had in mind, and then, be happy enough to let it go out into the world. And now that we're nearing the end, I also want to talk a little bit about how I think about lighting when I paint. Alongside illustration, I work professionally as a photographer and a motion director and occasionally director of photography. And I've found that these disciplines constantly influence each other. When I'm planning a shoot, I often find myself thinking like a painter. I imagine where I want the light to fall if I was illustrating the scene, and then I build the lighting around that idea. And interestingly, the opposite is also true when I'm painting, especially a color piece like this. I try to imagine how I would physically light the scene if I were shooting it on a film set. Early in my illustration career, I would often paint lighting that it just didn't make sense. I didn't fully understand how light was traveling and how it bounces between surfaces or how it rolls off over distance. And really learning those principles through photography, it's had a huge impact on my illustration career, whether or not I incorporate them or not. That said, I also know that this isn't a photograph, it's an illustration. And ultimately, it's a design piece. My goal isn't to recreate reality, it's to borrow enough from reality that the image feels believable. And while still giving myself the permission to exaggerate and simplify and compose things in a way that creates a stronger final illustration. And that's really the balance that I'm always trying to find when I often incorporate heavy line work into the illustration that outlines the forms. I do this for communication, as, lines aren't really a thing in real life. And here we come to the end of the illustration, where I typically take things to an external program, a little small mom and pop app called Photoshop that also just happens to be really good at enhancing images. At this final stage, I usually add a bit of grain or noise, and I try to do a bit of a color rebalance just to bring everything together for the final piece. I'd also like to take this moment to thank the team at Escape Motions for having me as one of their featured artists and for producing a genuinely excellent program. I've been doing digital drawing for longer than I care to admit, and I find Rebelle to be one of the most intuitive and enjoyable painting programs that I've ever used. It's incredibly well designed. It's efficient. It genuinely makes the process of painting feel easier and more natural. I still get excited every time I see the startup logo appear, followed by that big old intimidating blank canvas. It's always a pleasure to open. Thank you for taking the time to listening to this lunatic ramble on. I hope to share another one of these in the near future, and I hope you all have a great time. Take care. Bye-bye.